Mekadesh HaShabbos. Amen.
L'chaim.
I like how they added the crickets at the end of that recording. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was the Friday night kiddush, which we'll be talking about on today's daf, performed by the Maccabees. How are you on a fine Wednesday? It has cleared up here in LA. It was raining quite hard in the morning. Had a bit of a frustrating day today, and that we had some telephone issues, and a tech came out to work on it, and he was here for 3 hours, and at the end, he concluded that I was right, that there was a problem in the wiring, not in the modem, etc. And so another guy would have to come another day. But I'm proud of myself because I was never frustrated. It was just like, okay, work on it, we'll look at it, eventually it'll get fixed. What can you do? Life is there's too many important things going on in this world to stress the small stuff. Let's light up the darkness. All right, who is with us as we get it going on a fine Wednesday evening? Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Melissa in Great Neck, Randy in Florida, Paul in Chicago, John in Sedona, Timothy in Phoenix. Jane Larison says, watched When Do We Eat last night. Great movie. Posters right there. When Do We Eat is a movie that Nina and I wrote and I directed. And, I'm not usually pitching our movies to you, but it's a comedy, a very dysfunctional family comedy, and quite edgy, maybe a little edgier than we would make it if we made it today. It was earlier in our careers. It is rated R, but it's got so much Torah beneath the surface, and it's about Passover. It's about a Passover Seder. So definitely part of your learning, if you're okay with a rated R movie, there's no actual nudity. There is some language. There is some adult topics. So if you're okay with an R-rated movie, this is a great time to watch When Do We Eat as part of your Passover preparation. It's available on Apple Movies and Amazon Prime and Roku and a few other channels. And you can also get a signed DVD from us, signed by us, so that you just go to whendoweeat.com for that. Okay. Who else is with us? And thank you, Jane, for the warm endorsement of our film. Lucy in Minnesota, Paula in the house. Timothy says, bless you. Sharon says, funny, I was just working on the Shabbat evening kiddush with a student. How about that? Michael in Queens. John says, are you familiar with Debbie Friedman music? Sure, that second part of the Havdalah that we always do on Saturday nights is a Debbie Friedman melody. And John says he loves Debbie. John in Memphis, and by the way, I should say Debbie Friedman of blessed memory. I mean, her songs are just so popular throughout the Jewish world. It's funny also because she was very much working in the liberal Jewish, religiously liberal tradition. I'm not sure if she was reform or conservative, but not Orthodox. And, there's very little kind of migrating backwards from, reform and conservative traditions back into Orthodox. But the Debbie Friedman melody for Havdalah is just ubiquitous, even in the Orthodox world. And you hear the Maccabees using it. And, it's really great how it's just, really permeated the entire Jewish world. Renee in Indy, James says shalom. Nancy in North Carolina, Ann in Merced, Marion and Shimon in Long Island. And John says, great attitude, Sal. Thank you. That must have been about not getting frustrated about the phone repair. Steve in Tallahassee. Stephen Giger says, did you say thank you, Hashem? I should have said thank you, Hashem, for the delays. I don't know why I needed those delays, but perhaps I did. And perhaps it was just to talk about it. So thank you, Hashem, for the delays and getting that phone fixed. Let's see. Timothy says, neat studio. If you're referring to my office, thank you. Alex, hi from Scotland. Mike from Baton Rouge. Carolyn is tagging her friend Jeanette. And John says, must see ATTV, I guess referring to our movie. Paul says, hello, good to see you. John in Surfside and PK in Colorado. Welcome, everybody. Over there on the YouTube side, we have Samantha in Tacoma saying shalom and Lila Tov. Great. It's great to be together. We're in a series of quite short pages. So tonight's show is not going to be very long at all. And it's funny because like when you start Daf Yomi, you're in Tractate Brachos. And there, I mean, there's just so much material on every side of the page and in much of that tractate. And just speeding through can still be a really long class. And, you know, in some parts of Pesachim, we had long pages. Right now, we happen to be in a little stretch of where there's just not that much text on each page. I guess the commentators had a lot to say about these matters, but the editors of the Vilna Shas, when they laid out, well, I guess that's how they just laid it out. But the pagination goes, I'm not sure how far back the pagination of the Talmud goes. I'm just not sure when it was set. It was sort of set in the modern way in the Vilna Shas, I think that 1600s. But I'm not sure how much further back than that it goes. At any rate, it's a couple of short dafs that we're in now. Where are we holding? This is page 102, Daf Kuf Beis, here in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud, The Laws of Passover. We are in chapter 10, where it's getting very relevant to modern life because we're no longer talking about the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, the lamb or the goat, which we could only bring when the temple was standing, and it hasn't been in 2,000 years. We still study the laws in great detail, but we can't fulfill the obligation to bring that offering because the temple's not there. But of course, we do have Passover Seders. And the material here in chapter 10 is very relevant to how we observe Passover today. We're discussing the first Mishnah. We're continuing our discussion of the first Mishnah. The Mishnah held, among other things, that we have to have 4 cups of wine at the Seder, that we must recline to the left. It was a very short Mishnah. The 4 cups of wine, reclining, and it opened by saying that we have a pause in our eating. We don't eat from the afternoon the time of the afternoon prayer, let's say approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon before it's Passover that night. We don't eat anymore from that afternoon forward, so that when it's time to eat the matzah, we should do so with some hunger, right? We can look forward to it. And there were, of course, some disputes about that, whether we really need to stop eating or not. And as part of that discussion, we arrived at the topic of interruptions. When meals are interrupted, what happens, right? And so that's the topic that we've been discussing, what to do with an interruption. Like, for example, we were mentioning yesterday that there's a group of people eating a meal, and either they started eating, let's say, at lunch on Friday, and they just had so much to talk about, so much Torah to share, that their meal stretched out all afternoon, and before they knew it, nightfall came, and it's Shabbos, right? And so how should they handle that? Should they end their meal by saying the grace after the meals for their lunch, and then, clear all the food, and then reset the table, and then make kiddush and motzi for the Friday night dinner? Rabbi Yosef said that was not necessary, and that related to that kind of not eating on the afternoon before Passover. And then we also had the idea, what happens if people are having a meal? Could be Shabbos, could be not, doesn't really matter. It's just they're having a meal that includes bread, and then a bride and groom walk by outside, let's say with a procession, and it's a mitzvah to greet the bride and groom. So if they leave the table, should they first make the grace over the meal to end the meal that they were eating, go have fun with the bride and groom, entertain them, wish them a happy life together, etc., then come back in, and do they start the meal over again and make the blessings over their food as if they were beginning a brand new meal? Or could they just consider that it was just a temporary interruption, like when they went up and go to the kitchen, you don't have to, end the meal and restart the meal. is it different because they left the house? And we saw it is different that when they leave the house. However, if some members of the group stay at the table, then it is considered that the meal is continuous, and the ones that went out and came back don't have to say concluding blessings when they leave, nor introductory blessings when they return. So that's where we've been, and now we pick up this topic at the very bottom of page. Where am I? At the very bottom of page 101. But we're actually today's daf is page 102, and it's just 3 words, 4 words, 5 words at the bottom of page 101, and then we go to 102. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, page 102, who is the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnaic period, that taught that even in cases of uprooting oneself from a meal that requires a blessing of significance afterward, meaning they're having a meal that includes bread or one of the 7 species that characterize Israel. If it includes bread, then they have to say the full grace after the meal. If they didn't have bread, but they're having either wheat or barley or grapes, olives, figs, dates, or pomegranates, then there's a special blessing that they have to say over that food after they've eaten the food. In both cases, the grace after the meal or those blessings for eating one of the 7 species or multiple of the 7 species, there's a blessing that you need to say after the meal, and you need to say it in the place where you ate the meal. Okay, so if they've had that kind of a meal, either a meal with bread or a meal with one of the 7 species, so don't they need to say the concluding blessing before they get up and go somewhere? So it is Rabbi Yehuda. So in according to who's, in accordance with who, so it said even in case afterward. I'm sorry. Who is the Tana that taught that even in cases of uprooting oneself from a meal that requires a blessing of significance afterward, one nevertheless is required to recite a new blessing before resuming his meal? Because you might have thought that since they left and came back, and it was the kind of meal where for sure they need to say a concluding blessing. And when they left without saying that blessing, it's obvious that they were going to come back. They didn't forget. They just said, we're coming back, and we'll say the concluding blessing then. Even so, when they return, they should say an introductory blessing as if they're starting the meal over again. Who is the Tana who has that view? It is Rabbi Yehuda, as it was taught in a Baraisa. With regard to friends who were reclining and eating a meal and uprooted themselves to go to synagogue or to the study hall. So this is very similar to what we were talking about. They get up to go greet the bride and groom. That seems a little more spontaneous, right? They weren't planning on the bride and groom and their procession walking by outside. Here, it's like it's just their own decision. Hey, let's go to the synagogue or let's go to the study hall. We've been here a long time. Let's interrupt our meal and go pray, the evening service, for example, or let's go learn, or let's go look up some Torah in the study hall. So they interrupt to go to the synagogue or the study hall. When they exit, these foods do not require a blessing to be recited afterward. And when they return, these foods do not require an introductory blessing before resuming eating. Rabbi Yehuda said, in what cases this statement said, it's when they left some of their friends there at the meal. So it's that same ruling that we saw yesterday with the case of the bride and groom. If they left some people at the table, okay, that meal definitely was planned to continue after they came back, as evidenced by the fact that some members of the party stayed at the table while some left, even if it's to go to the synagogue or the study hall. However, if they did not leave some of their friends there when they exit, these foods do require a blessing to be recited afterward, and when they return, these foods require an introductory blessing. According to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, the Baraisa that served as the basis of the Gemara's objection on yesterday's page to the explanation of Rav Chisda actually represents the minority opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, whereas Rav Chisda holds in accordance with the majority opinion of the rabbis. The Gemara infers from this new baraisa that's being brought, the reason for this halacha, this law, is that it is only with regard to items of food that require a blessing after them in their place. For example, you had bread in a meal, and you have to say Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, after you finish that meal, that when the people eating them exit, these foods do not require a blessing to be recited afterward. And when they return, these foods do not require an introductory blessing, because you know you have to say a blessing after the meal. So even though you went out, if your plan is to come back, well, you're planning on saying the concluding blessings when you return. So you don't have to, end, make an official ending of the meal, leave and come back and make an official beginning of the meal, because you were always planning to come back anyway. However, even though this seems to be the majority opinion, as we saw yesterday, the minority opinion ended up being the law. You do have to say the concluding blessings and the new introductory blessings, unless you leave some people at the table. However, if they ate items of food that do not require a blessing, okay, that must be recited specifically in their place. Like they just had some water and fruit. Okay, so then you don't have to say either that grace after meals or the special concluding blessing for when you eat the 7 species. So then, even according to the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, when these people exit, these foods require a blessing to be recited afterward, and when they return, these foods require an introductory blessing. There is something that you say, it's just not that special blessing, and to make sure you don't forget, you say that Borei Nefashos, right? That the Lord makes to feed every creature. It's a very short blessing when we're not doing either the full grace after meals or the more abbreviated grace after meal for certain foods. Okay, meaning the 7 species. The Gemara suggests, shall we say that this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that a change of location never obligates one to recite a new blessing? Well, the Gemara expresses surprise at this proposition, but didn't we already refute Rabbi Yochanan's opinion once? Why is it necessary to refute his ruling yet again? And the Gemara admits that this is true, but adds, nevertheless, let us say that this baraisa is also a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, it's a very short page, but now I'm skipping to the last little clause on that page. The Gemara returns to the subject of interrupting one's meal to recite kiddush. The rabbis taught, with regard to members of a group who were reclining and eating a meal, and the day of Shabbos was sanctified, right? So this is, let's say they sat down to a late lunch on Friday afternoon, and they were talking and so, mesmerized by the conversation and the Torah that they were sharing, that they didn't even realize that it got dark outside and it became Shabbos. And then suddenly they're like, wait a minute, it's dark. It's Shabbos. So what are they supposed to do at that moment? So they bring one of the diners a cup of wine, and he recites over it the sanctification of the day, i.e. kiddush. And a second cup over which he recites grace after meals. So this is going to be the grace after meals for the lunch that went on. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosei says, one may continue eating the rest of his meal even until dark. Rabbi Yosei maintains that once they have finished their meal, they bring 2 cups, and over the first cup, he recites the grace after the meal for this long, long meal that stretched from Friday afternoon into Friday night. And over the second, he recites the sanctification of the day, which sounds a little strange to us because normally, of course, we say Kiddush at the beginning of the Friday night dinner, not at the end of this lunch that went on when presumably we're done and now we're going to get up from the table and go home. Is that a time to make Kiddush? Well, maybe it is in this very unusual circumstance of the Friday lunch that went all the way into the night. So that's how Rabbi Yosei would handle it. right, that they would bring 2 cups, and at the end of the dinner, and when do we say, by the way, why do we need a cup of wine for the Birkat Hamazon, right? When do we use a cup of wine for the grace after the meal? That's when you have a minyan. Right, so when you have a minyan, then the one leading the grace after the meals is also holding a cup of wine. When you don't have a minyan, you don't have to have that cup of wine. You still have to recite the grace after the meal. If you have 3 Jewish men or more, then you also do the zimun, the invitation to bless at the beginning. If you don't have three Jewish adult men there, then you just say the grace after the meal, and you don't do the zimun at the beginning, nor have a cup of wine in your hand as you're saying the grace after the meal. So assume that here we're talking about there's at least 10 guys at this meal. And so they're going to have 1 cup of wine for the Birkat Hamazon, for the grace after the meal, and another cup of wine for the kiddush to sanctify Friday night. And Rabbi Yosef would do both of those things at the end of this very long meal. Rav Huna said that Rav Sheshes said, one does not recite 2 sanctifications, i.e., for the 2 mitzvahs, like the grace after the meals and over the kiddush, 2 different mitzvahs, 2 obligations, over the same cup, over 1 cup. What is the reason for this law? Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, because one does not perform mitzvahs in bundles. If someone performs multiple mitzvahs all in one go, he gives the impression that they are a burdensome obligation and that he wants to complete it as fast as possible. So since the grace after the meal, it's a mitzvah, it's a Torah obligation, right? It says in the Torah, you shall eat and you shall be satisfied, and then you shall bless the Lord your God. In other words, you say a blessing before you eat to thank God for the food you're about to eat, and then you say a blessing after you eat to show your gratitude after you enjoyed, God's providence, right? So that's one obligation, and it's a different obligation to sanctify the day by making the kiddush at the Friday night meal. These are very different mitzvahs. So even though a situation might call for both of them to be performed back to back, as it were, you shouldn't perform both mitzvahs over the same cup of wine, because you give off the air of, I'm so obligated to do so many things, let me just get it done as fast and easy as possible. Says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, you shouldn't do that, right? So if you're going to make a Birkat Hamazon, there's 10 guys there, so you're going to make it over a cup of wine, that should be a different cup of wine than kiddush over Friday night, sanctifying Shabbos. And does one not, and is it true that one does not perform multiple mitzvahs together? But wasn't it taught in another baraisa that one who enters his home at the conclusion of Shabbos recites the blessing over the wine, and then over the light, and then over the spices, and thereafter he recites Havdalah over the cup of wine? That's a little bit out of order the way we do it today. When we make Havdalah, right? First we say a blessing over the wine, then we say a blessing over the spice, then we say a blessing over the light, and then we say the blessing of Havdalah. And we do say it all over, we say that over 1 cup of wine, but we don't drink the wine. When we first bless the wine, then we say the other blessings, then we make that Havdalah, and only then do we drink the wine. That's how we actually do it today. But let's continue how it's being discussed here in our Gemara. Right, so one who enters home at the conclusion of Shabbos, he recites the blessing over the wine, and then over the light, and then over the spices, and thereafter he recites Havdalah over the cup of wine. And if he has only 1 cup of wine, he leaves it for after he eats his food, and he uses it for the grace after meals, and arranges all the other blessings together thereafter. This baraisa indicates that one may use the same cup both for the grace after meals and Havdalah. Right? Not grace after meals and kiddush. Right now we're talking about grace after meals and Havdalah. So the Havdalah, which separates between Shabbos and the weekdays, right? We say Havdalah, meaning to separate, lahavdil, to separate between the holiness of Shabbos and the mundane days of the week. That's what we do on Saturday nights. So the Brisa indicates that one may use the same cup both for grace after the meals and Havdalah. The Gemara answers, we cannot prove anything from here, as a case where one does not have an additional cup is different. One who has 2 cups of wine is required to recite grace after meals over one of the cups and Havdalah over the other one. Now, this doesn't come up that often because the way things are normally happening is we have a Sudat Shlishi, a third meal on Saturday afternoon. And if we eat bread as part of that meal, so then we say the grace after the meal. And then, and we've already probably made mincha, the afternoon service. Then we finish that meal, probably share some Torah. Then it gets dark. Then we say the evening service. This is when we're in synagogue. We say the evening service, Mariv, which is the weekday service, but for Saturday night it has special editions, which actually include the Havdalah Blessing, which, blessing God for separating between the holiness of Shabbos and the rest of the days. And then very often I would come home and, maybe Nina didn't go to synagogue, so I want to make Havdalah for her, right? And so then we make Havdalah, and often we do that with the kids as well. And that's the traditional Havdalah ceremony where we have the light and the spice and the candle and a cup of wine. But we don't have a grace after meals issue because that third meal was done during Shabbos and now it's after Shabbos. But sometimes you have that situation where that meal went on and on and on, right? And now it's nighttime and it is time to say Havdalah, but you first have to make that grace over the meal. Can it be done over the same cup of wine? And we're learning here, no, it should not be done over the same cup of wine, but if you only have 1 cup of wine, then you could make it over the same glass of wine. The Gemara continues its line of questioning. But there is the case of a festival that occurs after Shabbos. Now this comes up, not so often, but within 3-4 years, it's going to come up at least once. And every time it comes up, everybody is flummoxed. Right? Everybody's like, "Wait a minute, what is it again? What is it again? How do we do it?" And so when you have, for example, Passover begins Saturday night. Okay, so we've discussed what happens in terms of when the temple is standing and we have to slaughter the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, that it overrides the restrictions of Shabbos when normally we would not slaughter an animal on Shabbos. We do because that's the right time to do it in the afternoon before Passover begins. We've talked about that aspect of Passover following right after Shabbos ends. But now we're talking about a different aspect. Well, when a festival comes in, and Passover is a festival, so we have to make a kiddush over the festival, sanctifying that day of the festival. But now we're leaving the holiness of Shabbos and immediately entering the holiness of the festival. And so now, what do we do about Havdalah? Right? We can't say the normal Havdalah because we're not separating between holiness and mundane. We're separating between holy and holy. So it's a different Havdalah altogether that we're going to do, and how do we do it? So that's the topic that we're discussing now. So there's the case of a festival that occurs right after Shabbos, when presumably one does have enough wine. So we're not going to have the problem you only have 1 cup of wine, especially if Passover's following Shabbos. You got to have 4 cups of wine at least per person, so there's plenty of wine around. And nevertheless, Rav said that the proper order of the blessings in that situation is the Hebrew acronym Yud Kuf Nun He, meaning Yayin. The first Yud is Yayin, wine. Kuf, kiddush. Nun is ner, that's the flame of the candle, and He is Havdalah. So according to Rav, the order is you make a blessing over wine, then you make kiddush to sanctify the new festival that's coming in, then you have the candle of Havdalah, and then you recite Havdalah. And the ruling shows that one recites kiddush and Havdalah over the same cup of wine. They say in answer to this question, from the fact that Rav did not say that one recites the blessing for time, meaning Ziman, which is going to come into this this acronym in a moment, meaning shechechyanu, right? So we have a shechechyanu blessing, which we say at every festival, right? Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has enabled us to reach this season, right? It's a very celebratory blessing, thanking God that we're alive, that we've lived to share and enjoy another Passover with our loved ones in this world. That's the shechechyanu. So that's blessing the time is what it's called. Who has given us life, shechechyanu, sustained us and brought us to this time. That's the shechechyanu blessing. And this proves by inference that we are dealing with the seventh day of Passover. Now, on the seventh day of Passover, it is a full-fledged festival, but we don't say shechechyanu because we said shechechyanu on the first day of Passover. And even though the seventh day is its own festival, we don't say shechechyanu because it is part of Passover. And this is the only festival day on which one does not recite the shechechyanu. We say it on the first day of Passover. We say it on the first day of Sukkot. There's also festival days at the end of Sukkot, but they are not considered the seventh day of Sukkot. They have their own identity, right? So that is Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah. If so, it is possible that whatever wine this person had, he has already consumed over the course of the festival, and he does not have enough wine left for the two separate cups. So we can't assume that we are allowed to say that we are allowed to say kiddush and Havdalah over the same cup of wine because maybe this is an exceptional circumstance where he only has one cup of wine left. It's the seventh day of Passover. They've been partying all week, and now they managed to save one cup of wine, and they have to use it both to say Havdalah for coming out of Shabbos and then for Kiddush going into the seventh day, which is a more important festival than the sixth day of Passover. The sixth day of Passover is just an intermediate festival day, but the seventh day of Passover is a full-fledged festival. The Gemara asks, but there is the case of the first festival night that occurs after Shabbos. Okay, first day of Passover begins Saturday night, when one has wine. And nevertheless, Abaye said that the order of blessings in this instance follows the Hebrew acronym Yud Kuf Zayin Nun He. So according to Abaye, what you do in that situation is Yud, Yayin, wine, Kuf, Kiddush, you make Kiddush. Zayin is for Ziman, meaning shechechyanu. Then Nun is the nair of the candle for Havdalah. And then Hey, you actually recite the Havdalah blessing. So the blessing over wine, the Kiddush, the blessing over the time, the blessing over the candle, and then Havdalah. But Rava said that the order of blessings is in accordance, and now I'm at the end of what we're going to talk about today, so I'm coming to your questions. The halacha, the law, is according to Rava. So the little abbreviation that I'm going to give you now, this is what you want to remember if you're in that situation where a festival follows Shabbos. Okay, you start a new festival right as on Saturday night. And Rava said that the order of blessings is in accordance with the acronym Yud Kuf Nun He Zayin. Yaknaz or Yaknahaz. Yaknahaz. I like it. Yakin house. Yakin, Yud, right? Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, Yakin, and then Havdalah and Zaman. Right, so house. However you want to remember this. Or if you want to use English letters, YKNHZ. Right? So Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, Havdalah, Zaman, meaning shechechyanu. Again, wine, the wine blessing, the Kiddush over the incoming holiday. The Ner is lighting the candle and saying a blessing over the flame. For the Havdalah, separating the previous Shabbos from the incoming festival, the Havdalah prayer, the Havdalah blessing over that candle, and then you say shechechyanu. And that is the halacha, that's the way we do it. Yakin house. So, rather, and that's what Rava said, And although Abaye and Rava dispute the correct order of the blessings, they agree that one recites multiple blessings over a single cup of wine. That's the bottom line. You're going to bless the wine, you're going to say kiddush over it, you're going to say Havdalah over it. So rather, the Gemara rejects the previous explanation in favor of the following. Havdalah and kiddush are one matter, as they both mark and draw attention to the sanctity of certain days. So we can say Havdalah and kiddush over the same cup of wine. But grace after meals and kiddush are two entirely different matters, right? So kiddush is sanctifying the incoming day, whether it's Shabbos or a festival. Havdalah is separating between the holiness of Shabbos or a festival that we're exiting and going to a new state, whether we're going back to a regular weekday or to the holiness of a different day. So these things are related. It's marking a separation in time. But the grace after meals is just thanking God for the food we just ate. That's a totally different kind of mitzvah. So even though we might combine blessings of Havdalah and Kiddush over a single cup of wine, when it comes to the grace after meals, which when there's a minyan present, you say over a cup of wine, you wouldn't want to use that same cup of wine for either Kiddush or Havdalah. And if you do, if you said the grace after meals and then the Kiddush over the same cup of wine, it would be considered disrespectful to God, because the message you're sending is, oh, all these obligations that you send my way, it's so burdensome and I just want to get through it as quickly as possible. So to be more thankful and respectful of God, you would use one cup of wine for the Birkat Hamazon and a different cup of wine for the Kiddush or Havdalah. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. Let us check comments and questions. Okay. Nina's telling me that several people had audio issues. I don't think it's here. I'm not seeing any indication that the audio going out is a problem. So hopefully it's, I don't know, just something in Facebook world or in other people. Let me know. I'm not aware of any local problem here. Sharon, I loved that folks who are unable to participate in the mitzvah of greeting the bride and groom were able to perform a meaningful function by staying behind. Very good. So yesterday we saw that in terms of this idea that people who interrupt a meal to go outside and greet the bride and groom, right? If they leave some members of the meal of the group behind at the table, okay, so then the meal is continuing. They just went out for a few minutes and then they're going to come back, and it's expected that the meal doesn't end and then start a new meal. But only because they left some people at the table. Now, when we learn that teaching, whereas here, with regard to people getting up to go to synagogue or the study hall, it just says that they left some friends at the table. Yesterday, with respect to going out to meet the bride and groom, the Gemara said, if sick or elderly people are present and they remain at the table because they don't run out to dance with the bride and groom. But Sharon's point is, okay, for them it's a bummer that they can't go out to join in the simcha, in the joy of entertaining the bride and groom, but by holding down the fort, as it were, and keeping that meal going, they are fulfilling their own mitzvah, their own obligation, which helps the group that went outside as well. And so there's a role for everybody to play. Michael says, my wife says that 3 women or 10 women also qualify for these zimun and wine. In the non-Orthodox world, that's how the law is interpreted now. But in the traditional world, for a zimun or for a minyan, you need 10 adult Jewish men. So that's just a difference between the traditional world and the more liberal Judaism, modern Judaism, meaning Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, etc. It's just worth saying that while the law has changed in those circles, the traditional, the Orthodox world rejects that change, that evolution of the law. It's worth noting that that change in the law only came, these kind of streams of Judaism are only a couple hundred years old. And in fact, those revisions in the rulings, at least in the conservative movement, I think they're probably less than 50 years old. So that's just the way things break down there. Nina's giving me a note. I think he may be saying when it's only women and not mixed. Oh, that's interesting. I'm not aware of that ruling or how that works. That's so interesting. I'd have to look into that. So when there's only women, do they make a zimun if there's 3 of them? Do they make a Birkat Hamazon over a cup of wine if there's 10 of them? That's very interesting. I'm not aware. I'll have to look into that. Sharon, so why do we use the same bracha over the 4 cups of wine of the Seder using the same cup? Well, perhaps, as we've seen, you can... you're asking me a different question. Here we're saying there's different blessings over the same cup of wine, right? So that you could make a Havdalah and a kiddush over the same cup of wine. Though it's preferable not to, you could. You're saying at Passover, we make a blessing over the first cup of wine, and then we don't make a blessing over the next cup of wine, even though I think 2 of those cups are after the meal, right? I'm not ready to talk about this. Generally speaking, we already saw even yesterday that when new bottles of wine are added to a meal, we don't say a blessing again. We had in mind that the first time we blessed the wine at that meal, our blessing would cover all of the wine that we consume at that meal. But if we finish the meal, because we say Birkat Hamazon, and then we bring out more wine, so then we should need to say a bracha over that new wine that has come out after we already concluded the meal. So there you go. Okay. Michael, if Shabbos ends late, like 9 o'clock, now we're talking summer Shabbos, right? Can't you have a full dinner before the end of Shabbos? Absolutely. Absolutely you might. I mean, you're supposed to have a dinner anyway. Even when Shabbos ends early, you should try to have some kind of a meal on Shabbos afternoon, even though it might happen that you end up, if your morning service goes late and you don't even have lunch until like 1 o'clock, right? And you finish at, 2, 2:30, even 3. And then Shabbos is going to end like at 4:30 or 5, in the winter in northern climates, you should actually try to squeeze in a third meal because, one of the ways that we delight in Shabbos is to have 3 meals on Shabbos, if at all possible. But in summer, it's much easier to do that. And finally, Mahalakshmi Meg Dom says... with regard to the Matisyahu video, thank you. You have had some amazing music on this show. I firmly stand that you should bring back Moshe. Absolutely, bring back Moshe Storch. Man, as soon as, COVID ends, there's a lot of things that we want to start doing. When we're having like a monthly Rosh Chodesh, with a musical Hallel and with a lot of people, and I can broadcast that live to you. We want to do that, We've been so blessed to have Matisyahu singing in our backyard, Zusha, Nisim Black, all kinds of people, Shlomo Katz, Eitan Katz have all performed here. Yeah, please God, end this plague primarily for the health of everyone in the world. But once we've got that handled, so we can have live music events again, it would be great. So thank you for that, Meg. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, to continue our discussion of how we deal with interruptions and festivals abutting Shabbos. We're actually going to have opportunity to go through that abbreviation, that acronym again, Yaknaz or Yakinhaus, but how to handle when a festival follows Shabbos and you have to make blessings over wine and kiddush and then Havdalah, right? So interesting that you make kiddush before Havdalah, right? So it is interesting. You would think that you would make Havdalah and then kiddush, and some of the sages hold that way. But in the end, no, you say Kiddush and then Havdalah. So Kiddush is over the new holiday coming in, and Havdalah is separation from the old holiday going out. But they have their reasons for doing that, and we'll continue that discussion tomorrow.